y'all doing? For this review, I'm going to cover a book which I found at the local new used bookstore here in town. It's a book that goes to a series I have never read before, but I know of it. I've seen some of the paperbacks my mother has on the shelves, and I've read about from time to time from those mention it. The series I'm talking about is Stephen R. Donaldson's Thomas Covenant Chronicles. The book I'm talking about is Gilden-Fire. This is a novella cut from the second book of the 10. To sum it all up, Thomas Covenant is a series that's been written by Donaldson from 1977 to as far as 2013, covering 10 books in 3 sets. The first 2 are trilogies, and the 4th one's a tetralogy. This novel I have here is to the second part of the first trilogy. First trilogy is Lord Fal's Bane, the Illearth War, and the Power That Preserves. This is to the second book, the Illearth War. It's cut from that. The story is pretty simple. We are dealing with 3 main characters. We have a, Corric Bloodguard, and there's also Lord Shetra and Hiram, 2 companions here. Corric Bloodguard is, and the other 2, they're on a mission with a small crew of other Bloodguard to travel through this forest and into to a place called Sea Reach, which they have to go to negotiate the giants, if I recall correctly, to help them out in this upcoming war. And it's a pretty simple, straightforward. It's less than 100 pages of proper story about that. It's a novel. It's not that long. And upon their adventures going through the forest, they get through what's called Gilden-Fire. They also go through these monstrous creatures called Urviles, and and a pack of wolves, and the troubles they go through that. And the story ends after they go across that. They don't finish the mission at the end of this. It's just cuts off right when you get past all those dangers. So with that said, why was this cut from it? Well, let's look into that. Okay, so in the foreword written by Donaldson himself, I'll read parts of this to give, he talks about, the version of the manuscript, the second book, the Illearth War, the version of that, which originally crossed the desk of Lester Del Rey at Ballantine Books, was 916 pages long, roughly 261,000 words. That was manifestly too long. With much regret, Lester gave me to understand that I would have to cut 250 pages out. Well, I'm a notorious overwriter, and I was able to eliminate 100 pages simply by squeezing the prose with more than my usual ruthlessness. But after that, I had to make a more difficult decision. As it happened, the original version of the Illearth War was organized in 4 parts rather than the present 3. Part 2 in this version dealt exclusively with Corric's mission to Sea Reach, and eventually provided me with the 150 pages of cut I still needed. Not because I considered the material to be secondary importance. I have little sympathy for anyone who considers the fate of the unhomed and the fidelity of the Bloodguard, and the valor of the Lords to be secondary importance. On the contrary, I was quite fond of the whole section. No, I put my axe to the roots of my former Part 2 for reasons of narrative logic. From the beginning, that section had been a risky piece of writing. In it, I had used Corric as my viewpoint character. For the first time in the trilogy, I had stepped fully from Thomas Covenant or any direct link to the real world, and that proved to be a mistake. It was crucial that the presentation of Covenant's character that he had some good reasons for doubting the substantial reality of the land. But all his reasons were undercut when I employed someone like Corric, a character with no bond, however oblique, to Covenant's world, for a narrative center. The Illearth War does contain 2 chapters from Lord Moram's point of view, but in both cases, Moram is constantly in the company of either Covenant or Hyle Troy. Corric's mission lacked even the connection to the central assumptions on which Lord Fal's Bane and Illearth War were based. In using Corric as I had informed the reader that the people of the land were in fact real. I had unintentionally denied the logic of Covenant's unbelief, which he was already too fragile for its own good. Therefore, I took the absolute essential sections of that Part 2 and recast them as reports which Runic and Toll brought back to Covenant and Troy, thus preserving the integrity of the narrative perspective from which the story has been viewed. And in the process, I achieved 150 pages of cut I needed. But all of Gilden-Fire was lost. That does not exactly constitute high tragedy. Cutting is part of writing, and narrative logic is more important than authorial fondness. My point is simply that Gilden-Fire was cut not because it was bad, but because it didn't fit well enough. However, the question remains. If this material didn't fit the Illearth War, why am I inflicting it upon the world now? The main reason, I suppose, is my aforementioned fondness. I like Corric, Hiram, etc., and I have always grieved over the exigency which required me to reduce their role in the story so drastically. But, in addition, I've often felt that the moral dilemma of the Bloodguard is somewhat obscured in the published version of my books. Too much of their background was sacrificed when I cut Gilden-Fire. In fact, too much development from the people who would eventually have to face the destruction of their own home was sacrificed. How, for instance, can Lord Hiram's achievements be fully understood when so little is known about him? You'll read that in this, which you'll read about that in this section here. By publishing Gilden-Fire, I'm trying to fill a subtle but real gap in the Illearth War. Finally, I should say that I think the logic which originally required me to cut it out this material no longer applies. Since it cannot stand on its own as an independent story, I kind of doubt that. I mean, of course, I read enough short stories to where I think it can work. Gilden-Fire is surely not, will surely not be read by anyone unfamiliar with the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. And those readers know that the question of whether or not the land is ultimately real, whether or not the characters like Corric is sufficiently actual to preserve it as a narrative viewpoint, no longer matters. In reality, as in dreams, what matters is the answer we find in our hearts and to the test of despite. By publishing Gilden-Fire, I hope to give more substance to the answers of Corric, Hiram, etc. So, with what Donaldson said about only the people who know about Thomas Covenant will ever want to read this story here, I am pretty much the exception to that, as there usually is to such rules. Now, again, I got this because of the Stephen Fabian art, like the cover right here and a couple other ones that I'm showing right now. That's what attracted me to this book. And then I found out it's connected to this. So, I don't plan on getting a trilogy, the whole series anytime soon. I'm not interested in reading 10 books of fantasy here, no matter how good or bad they are. But with this, I do enjoy the short work in and of itself. Sure, it's it has a beginning here. You got 3 characters who are not the main characters of the series is attached to. They're side characters, but according to the author, they're important enough to mention here. But he had to cut them out for logical reasons, as I just mentioned. And the story itself leaves off, just after their danger, but they still have a ways to go. They didn't complete their mission yet. But I could say, but I could take that as a short work in of itself. Enough to get one interested. It's like, hey, you read let's just say you read a work of Conan and you like that one, so you read more books of Conan. Now, the problem with that method of being with Gilden-Fire is that usually when you get something attached to the world and you get attached to these characters, you're usually expecting to join more of the journeys of these characters. But if I decided to go read the series, it's going to focus on Thomas Covenant, the real hero of the story about this. But I could still enjoy this of itself. It's a little topsy-turvy as the normal patterns of fantasy works go. I don't think it's bad. If you find this, if you're already a Thomas Covenant fan, you don't have this one, look for this one, particularly the Stephen Fabian, artwork one. But it's also published in another anthology somewhere. Which one is it? Gilden-Fire, appeared by this. In the short, it also shows up Donald's short story collection, Daughter of Regals, 1985. So there's a way you can get the story if you're a Thomas Covenant fan. But yeah, it's not much to this work. It's just the adventures of 3 characters in Thomas Covenant's world and their mission, in preparation to the upcoming war in the second book of the first trilogy of the 10-book series. But not bad in and of itself. I mean, compared to a lot of fantasy these days, you can't go wrong with things like this. As I say, with things like Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, which you can read for free, I think something like this could have worked in a modern publication like this. And you may not get the whole context of everything, but it might get you interested to read more of what he's done. With that said, Gilden-Fire, Stephen R. Donaldson. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.